Hello, everybody. Achilles Justice here, Philosophy Society. It is July 12th, 2023. We're at Toronto Metropolitan University Library. And I am going to continue from what we were discussing last week. So last week, we reviewed in a bit more detail the three kind of ways we can observe ourselves and the social context. So, and then from that point, we're going to jump to the notion of a function. And in this context, a function would be like a decision or an action. It's something that you do. So we're just going to find ourselves a good marker. Let's try this one. This one's on it. Number 3.
How was it trying?
There we go. Functions. So something you do, or another way to say it, it's an action or a decision. It would also be an exercise of volition, or another way you could say like free will. Yeah. So in this context, we have so the common denominator in our experience would be what do we think? What is the one thing that's always present in your experience all at once? Let's go back to Immanuel Kant.
I want to say growth.
Okay, sure. Yeah. What is the thing that is even constant within growth?
Self.
It is the self. Okay. The self is not necessarily a constant, because then we get like problems of identity. We can have a dynamic self.
What does that mean?
It changes within a content within boundaries. So it accounts for that I'm not the same person now as I am now. Right? So
Except for like the key core values. But those can change too. Like,
we can extrapolate what the self is. But for now, we are going to kind of keep it as a constant.
okay.
Just to go to the next level. So in some ways, if self is here, there's going to be information that we're going to talk about at like this kind of level, but then there's also information we could talk about on what the nature of the self is. So we're not going to go over here at the moment. We're going to go over here. And over here, we have 3 things. So the first one is the psychological properties on the self. The second one would be the socio-cultural. And the last one would be environmental. Now, environmental is external and in some ways internal. So internal would be like your body. External would be like the room. And it could even, like, you could say that like how, like the bystander effect, like the amount of bodies in the room, they are physical objects. So there could be some merging of sociocultural influence and environmental influence. But maybe we would put that because they're physical things, it's an environmental condition. Whereas when it comes to cultural practices or beliefs, it's sociocultural.
Want to explain that little drawing we did there because I couldn't really see what you're.
This one?
Yeah.
So we're not gonna talk about what the self is right now. That's a different discussion. To define the self as a dynamic changing entity. Oh, another one? Hello, welcome. So today we are talking about functions in the context of different factors that influence and or affect the self. The self is the common denominator in all of our experience. And so the properties that change have different tiers of explanation. There is a in some ways a boundary of phenomena relative to psychological phenomena. And in this, we had attention, we had nonverbal behavior, we had like verbal. Sometimes I think faster than I write. which is semantic. And then there's one more. Forget this one, but we talked about it last time. So there's one more. And it's not exhaustive. So these properties, there could be other properties. And then sociocultural, in this context, we talked about belief. Relative to like the ratio of members within a group. So 3 out of 10 believe in Y, and 7 out of 10 believe in X. And that will compose to some degree the integrity or solidarity of the group, right? Depending on what they believe. And so political and religious groups, we can understand them in some ways and how they interact with each other based on what they believe. And then environmental factors will situate all of these other factors in some ways, right? If I'm in a burning building, that's dramatically going to change my behavior. So when we're looking at how to understand like what we're doing or the situation we find ourselves in or what's going on or why this person's doing that, we could say we observe a self and we're going to layer on top of it these different functions. So the psychological factor on the self, we can do the socio-cultural factor on the self, or the environmental factor on the self. And then that way, what we can do is we can kind of explain whatever this individual is doing, or groups of individuals. And the group, which would be all of these individuals together, in some ways is an emergent phenomenon. So if you have one person, more space. You have one person here, that person collected together with all the other people creates the group. And it's important to understand properties of the individual and then look at the function of the group relative to those properties. So now another factor here, which in some ways has to do with our attention, I'm going to shift it a bit. It might be overlapping. We can say it's the same thing, but it would be our conscious perception of the self. And that's really self-awareness. And then at the same time, there's an influence of the self on our conscious awareness of the external world. And so this is akin to like our biases / prejudice / heuristics. So our self-awareness is always limited by the self, right? We don't have pure awareness of things.
What is limited on self?
The self limits itself, right? So not to be circular, but if I'm observing something, I'm always imposing, for example, a sociocultural framework on that thing. Or if I'm like in the David Burns book, we have to understand an event before we can ascribe emotional content to that event, right? So if we have like the burning building example, we're like, oh no, I have to understand that this is dangerous. If I'm far away, I might just think it's like a mirage or like a firework or something like that. It's not threatening. But if I perceive it as something that could be harming others or myself, then I'll elicit fear. There might be some instinctual fear that's responded automatically in some ways, like we might have some instincts for this. Yeah.
Is it possible to observe without evaluation?
So this is the thing, exactly. What would that be, right? What do we do to reduce our biases, prejudices, and heuristics when it comes to this element of consciousness?
I feel like we do that subconsciously.
Okay.
Observing without interpreting. Let's say like you're driving and you see like a sign pass by. You don't really pay attention much to it, but then something else down the road makes you remember that you saw that sign, for example. Then it brings it to your awareness. So I believe we do observe without interpretation, but not very frequently. It's a kind of a rare
But I wonder if there's a difference between seeing and observing, because you can see the sign, but you're not necessarily, to me, observation requires a bit more attention.
You're right. Observing without,
It's like the difference between hearing and listening.
you're right, yes.
Yeah,
Observing
observation and interpretation.
and-
Observation is supposed to be an elimination of bias, which is just not imposing assumptions on what is, right? And that's what we're supposed to be doing scientifically. We're making observations. Now, one of the questions we would say is it even ever possible to observe something objectively? And with what I'm saying here, no, right? Like it's like a limit. So a limit is a function that approaches zero, but never actually crosses it.
We call it subject. Or object.
Are we ever able to be objective?
Is it possible to observe something without?
I would argue yes, but that you'd have to do that through meditation, because with
There you
meditation
go.
you stop thinking.
That was the answer. Meditation / mindfulness.
So I guess it wouldn't be in the material world, the observing, like you'd be observing your thoughts without interpretation. Through meditation, like you say.
I don't think you have any thoughts when you're meditating.
There's two types of meditation, like the one where you focus on breathing and one where you notice your thoughts flow. And that's where you do it without observation, I mean, without interpretation. We don't latch
I'm
onto
not
it.
familiar with that nuance. I'm learning that today.
Yeah, it's
My understanding of meditation is absence of thought
there's two
completely.
or three types.
There's different types of meditation.
Yeah, the one where mindlessness, mindfulness, I believe is the other one. Where you just sit and you observe your thoughts as they come, you don't latch onto it.
Mhm.
You see what thought comes and you allow it to go like a river. And then there's the other form of meditation, which I've just found recently, is where you're aware of your surroundings, like the extremities of your body. Like if you notice right now the tips of your fingers, they're tingling, bring your awareness to it.
It has a focus. It could be on
Correct, on something
body
else.
sensation. It could be on focus on something.
Or like in class the other day when I was with Achilles, he made an observation with the humming in the room, which I didn't notice from the fan.
Got it, everybody.
And then once you brought it up to my awareness, I started observing it as well.
Very good.
Well, it's kind of like you don't realize that there's a tongue inside your mouth, and then the moment you pay attention to it, it's kind of like you don't want it in there.
This appendage, where did it come from?
You can smell the inside of your nose too.
Very strong.
Okay, so what we've just done is we provided a proof for why it's important to practice meditation and mindfulness, is to reduce the effect of our current self on the function of consciousness as a pure, I don't want to say a priori thing, because that's like a reasoning it's like a reasoning proof, like knowledge that we have without experience. But consciousness is just kind of something that is part of embodiment in the human condition. Without consciousness, are you really fully human? And so how do we become more objective? How do we deal with this? So there's a function of consciousness influencing the self. I'm conscious of the self, which is self-awareness, but I'm self of my consciousness. Myself is the thing doing it. So the way we can see that the difference here is when two people look at the same object, they may interpret different things, even though they're both human, and consciousness is the fundamental faculty that is, I don't know, I want to say in motion, but being exercised or in action, right?
So just for clarity, so that function, that curve, is one extreme side the extreme bias and the other extreme side extreme unbiased or something like that? Are you trying to tap into that? Or?
It's just like if I was very biased, I'm getting closer and closer and closer to not being biased,
Yeah.
but I'm never biased. I think that's a little unrealistic to think that's the case. And the reason is because, again, we go back to Immanuel Kant, there's this notion of a perception. Myself is always part of every experience.
So it's like there needs to be some level of judgment for a being to be present,
Yeah.
something like that. So can there be a bridge though? If, well, like between complete observation without any judgment? I'm just posing this as a question.
Yeah.
Some sort of bridge.
So Kant, again, talks about the relationship between the phenomenon, that which we perceive, and the noumena, the thing in itself. And it's just the nature of reality that we can never know the thing in itself because we always use ourselves to perceive that thing. You can't take the self out, there'd be no perception then. Right?
Is a self the soul?
You could say that. You can interpret it that way. This is more dynamic though. Like, so when you go over here, and like, remember we said, we're not really going to define self right now. We're going to take that term and then go over here with it. But if you go this way, you say, well, what is the self? You could talk about soul. You could talk about mind to some degree. The problem is that depending on these terms, the definitions will get a little funky in some areas. Like, for example, souls are supposed to be like forever. That if you get brain damage, your soul's not supposed to be affected by that, right? However, the self kind of would be, right? So there's some circumstances where depending on these terms, they won't actually translate directly.
What if the self is the expression of the soul?
We can talk about that. Yeah, sure. We still have to prove the existence of the soul, though. We would always have to figure out where that is.
Didn't one of the scientists do an experiment where he had someone on deathbed and he took their weights before they were dying, and then after they passed, he noticed the weight difference after the soul had passed.
Same thing with dogs. They tried it on dogs.
They tried it on as well, and he had like this special permission to like get it on people who were actually like literally about to die. It's not like he went to kill people.
Sure, that's good. We'll do that.
So yeah, forgot the name of this professor or scientist, whatever he was.
So the problem would just be like,
No, sorry.
I know the test.
like the illusory correlation. Is that how do we know that the reduce of mass after death necessarily connects to soul stuff? It could just be something else.
Energy does not create nor destroy itself. That's physics says, and that's a law in physics at least. And we are energy. Like our soul, our consciousness is what makes us move.
Have you heard of the term prana or life force?
Prana?
Prana or life
In Hinduism,
force.
I think it's,
Yeah, so-
it's like
The argument is that there are not multiple souls. There's just one energy in the entire universe.
I believe it's called chi in the Chinese.
There are many terms in different kind of
related to
branches, but it argues of one energy in the entire existence of the universe, and what we are experiencing are just multiple versions of that same energy.
I would say that's God.
So I wonder if it's when that person dies and the weight kind of reduces, it's just the life force just kind of emptying itself off of the cadaver.
See, if you say that, if you say like it's all one energy in that sense, I'm a little bit theological here, not philosophical. How like that is God, because like
Yeah,
God
like
is
we're-
within everything, he's
yeah.
within all of us in the theological perspective. And that how he's in everything, and we are all basically part of God, because we're all, I guess, part of him in a way.
Or it.
Or it. Yes.
Yeah, like it's just again, we don't really know. Like it's like or the third variable problem. That's another way to say it. Like how do we know that it's the soul or something else?
So third variable problem, I think, if I remember correctly, maybe I don't, and you guys could correct me. Third variable problem, it's like they say, it's like correlation is not causation. So what they say is like correlation. If two things are related, it's not necessarily that one causes the other. It's possible that the third variable is causing both. So when I heard the term third variable, what did you mention? Third variable
Problem?
Problem, yeah. I think that's what I remembered.
Yeah. Oh, very good.
Correlation is a causation.
So when we go back to our principles of scientific thinking, whenever we postulate a hypothesis, right, it may be a soul, right? We would want to find a way to falsify that statement. We really want to know if it's true.
Definitely both sides.
You know, like, is it really true? Because even like, if it was the soul escaping out and some form of energy or chi, maybe you could just have like a vent that captures it and then power nuclear fusion, for example. Then you'd be like, that's unethical. You're taking my soul away. You know, you don't use it to power your car. But people would do that. They would, maybe it's clean energy. You know, just like that's
Pure
the
energy.
right. It's like taking methane from cows when they fart or something like that. You know, it's just like taking the souls out of all the humans and using it for some other purpose. So the point I'm trying to say is that like, if it is an energy, it's within the observable universe. And we know of 4 fundamental forces. So the only one it could really maybe be would be electromagnetism. And when you do like an observation of like electromagnetic fields, they're all over the place. And we don't really, I don't really think we see them.
There's a way that this one scientist did actually, where he had a magnet and he had like a bunch of iron dust, and he threw the dust in the air and then slow mode the video and saw like the electromagnetic field of the magnet. And that's how he knew we have that basic structure, and how the Earth has that also structure of the poles and goes around and comes to the bottom, just how we do, just how every.
Isn't that called the torus?
Is it called the
Torus.
T?
It's this magnetic field that each human has.
How do you call it?
Torus.
The torus. The bull.
Yeah, apparently it begins from the heart and then it kind of vibrates.
That makes sense because the bull has like horns and they go in the same manner.
So whenever we have ideas, we want to always take our critical thinking toolbox and our scientific toolbox and try to evaluate so that we have knowledge. Because we may have beliefs, but the problem with beliefs is they can be true or false. And for it to be knowledge requires justification. I have to be able to prove it, or at least rationally explain why this statement is true. Right?
Repetition, like if it's been repeated, like if it's something seen within multiple people and multiple people have experienced it, would that be considered
So replication,
replication?
there's a replication crisis in psychology. One of the major issues is like 50% of all the studies are not replicated, which means that when someone first did a study and discovered that like whenever people hiccup, you know, somebody across the room sneezes. I'm just making this up.
Yeah.
And then like, oh, we have a correlation of 0.7. Like it's a thing, you know, like it's not just hiccup, it's hiccup over sneeze. It's like its own thing. But then someone across the world who has taken the same methodology and applied it with a different group, maybe a larger group of participants, have not found the same results. They did not replicate the same results utilizing the same methodology. And so that's a crisis because it shows that almost the entire science in some ways is invalid. And so psychology, that's some work for the next like 50, 100 years, is to figure out how they can revise the method and the peer review process to rule that out. So, okay. So we're going back to the notion of the limit, which is to say, how can we be objective, right? Which would also mean like, how do I know that my beliefs are true? I don't like to walk around with false beliefs is equivalent to just being subjective. Well, that's just for you, like it's like saying you like apples and you hate pears. Well, some days I'll eat a pear. I'll Google it, no problem eating, right?
Which is why I have a big problem with the current trend of people saying there isn't a truth, but rather your truth and this person's truth, and I find that very problematic.
Mm-hmm.
Because to me, there's only the truth.
Yeah.
There are lived experiences, sure, I can agree with that, but I don't believe that there is such a thing as his truth, her truth, their truth.
They believe it's true.
Right.
They just mean to say that's what you believe.
To me, that's no different from being delusional.
Yes.
Yeah.
True. That's true.
So
That's just me.
I was about to ask, like, don't you have to really ponder and have a lot of proof before you believe something? But then you just mentioned being delusional, where go through that stage, you just breathe it without,
Despite evidence or reason.
yeah.
And so we don't want to do that.
But that's someone with like reduced cognitive capacity. Let's say, like a regular person who wouldn't necessarily per se start believing things left, right, and center without testing it, right?
We went through this before. On one end, we could talk about being delusional.
Because like believing something, it's like a big thing. It's like It's a yes or a no.
So you can be delusional and at the same time you can be arrogant, right? So maybe arrogance is more of an emotional thing. I'm uncomfortable accepting I am wrong. Whereas delusional is more like a prefrontal cortex. I just can't process the difference between truth and falsehood. I am just, I have engaged in rigid thinking, right? Once I have programmed a belief, I'm stuck with it. It's very difficult to disengage and then re-engage. That's
It's like counter the belief. I mean, if you're open-minded enough, I believe if you get supporting evidence on the other side, and you look for yourself, then
yeah, sometimes there's evidence that if you give people contrary evidence, it will increase their crazy beliefs even more, right? Like if you go to the MAGA supporters and you're like, did you see Trump stole the documents? Look, and then they say it's all fake. Everything.
I feel like it's harder to change your belief when you're older because you've been predispositioned with that belief for so long that it's been so hardwired into your belief system that it's very hard to counter.
And also their brains don't have as many kind of neural pathways as a younger person. It's like instead of like 10 highways, there are only 3. So there are only 3 possible answers, right?
Because they're used to that
That's
same
why
neural
old people
pathway.
tend to be kind of racist and that sort of thing. And I don't know. I'm generalizing, but I find that they have simplified understanding of things.
Interesting. You're not open-minded, basically,
Yeah.
is what you're saying.
I wouldn't say it's all old people. It might just be that,
Not all, but
yeah. That would be like if like you said, over general. Okay, let's try to come back here. Okay, so can we be objective? And to say that we're going to know the thing in itself, we read the critique of pure reason, like, oh, that can't be the case, right? So we can only perceive it through the self, right? And so even though I am perceiving through the self, I have these biases, prejudice, there's some heuristics going on here, some speed of processing. Well, what can I do to increase my objectivity? Is there anything I can do? And James came in with the curveball of light, and he's like, of course, you can meditate. He's true, or he's correct. That is true. Through meditation, we can become mindful of ourselves. And I would just say not only meditation, but also some education too, right? When I become aware of certain biases, education and feedback. We're going to do a trio here. So we're going to do meditation, right? We're here somewhere. Meditation to increase self-awareness, right? But then also some education, which is our knowledge or facts. Like, what is a bias? So if a 7-year-old, you teach a 7-year-old to meditate, that's good for the brain, right? And their awareness. But if they have no concept of, the self-serving bias, then they can't detect it, right? It's like reading, right? For you to know what D is, someone had to have taught you. And then once they've taught you, then you can engage in your mindfulness. You're like, that is D. Now, the last part would be feedback. Why is feedback so important? Well, because we're wrong. Fucking wrong, man. Shit. Now what do I do? And then we go back up to here. When I'm incorrect, do I engage in arrogance? Am I being delusional? How do I deal with my cognitive dissonance? So that's one thing. It's almost like a problem. I'm thinking faster than I can write. So one problem is the cognitive dissonance. Another one is like the bias stuff, etc. So the philosophy society, that's where our department is. We're gonna practice certain things to teach ourselves that it's okay, or not that it's okay. When you experience dissonance, it's okay to experience dissonance. How you deal with it, there's most likely a healthy way or ways and some unhealthy ways, right? Like manipulating the social context to make it seem like you are not wrong at all. That is like, you fuck, like, oh, damn it. Like, we're making some progress here. And then you're telling me that I'm gaslighting you? Okay, maybe that's the case. Or maybe you're just completely incorrect. It wasn't a rabbit. It was a shoe, Maybe you're just wrong. And so how do we So one is again, like, how am I psychologically dealing with dissonance? How am I dealing with it? And then how is the other dealing with it? And so I can learn techniques to monitor my own dissonance and to regulate it, right? That's responsibility. That's a good thing. But then when I observe other people having dissonance, and let's say it's important that they have accurate information, like if you're in business together and there's some money on the line, or you don't want someone to like cheat or steal money or something like that, right? We want that person to process their dissonance in a healthy way. So let us create, now we go back to this property. So you have the group. If there are two people, it is a group, right? So whenever there's an other, you're automatically in a group. Yeah.
Try to counter, but isn't two people a pair? The group is more than three.
I'm just saying there's individual, the self, and then there could be a group, which is either a dyad on infinitum. It's just multiple individuals.
Gotcha.
Because as soon as there's the self and the other, it instantaneously changes things because now I'm being observed. And so that changes my sense of self. And so that would go under the group dynamic.
Probably the side effects of never being not in a group. For example, like always being under observation. Example.
So Foucault talked about the panopticon, which is this like prison where the guards are here and they can view out in every direction, and the prisoners all have their cells and are completely exposed at all times. So they never have privacy.
Mhm.
And he says it's like one of the worst forms of torture. It's not good. So we need to have some privacy with ourselves.
How did you call it?
The panopticon. So, okay. Yeah. So meditation is one step, but we also need to have some knowledge and then have others give us feedback to say, hey, is it true that what you became mindful of is really what you think it is? Right? For example, optical illusions, right? You may think that you saw something, like, or the belief in the paranormal. I saw a ghost. I saw a UFO. You know, I levitated. I had these experiences. You know what I mean? Well, is it true? I was mindful of it. I think that's what it was. But if I don't have feedback, I'm isolated in my own subjective world. I'm not going to call it reality. Let's save the term reality for what really is. Reality is the noumena. And we can try to come closer and closer to reality, but we're never really going to know. So reality is when we are correct about our perceptions. And whenever we get feedback, it's always true. Right? That way, we don't have any ambiguity with the term reality. So while we're doing this, whenever we're using words, our critical thinking is always going on. And what do I mean by that? So one would be like reducing ambiguity. You want things to be clear and distinct, or eliminating equivocation. You know, I am either Fox or MSNBC. The problem with Fox is there's a lot of opinion and a lot of problems with evidence. Like if there was a spectrum, there is a lot of issues with Fox.
They're owned by the same company.
As MSNBC, sure.
All of the major American news corporations are owned by the same.
That's kind of my problem with mainstream media is you're given an illusion of choice of opinions, but they're all kind of going back to the same owner. So it's kind of like
Rudolph, where was he? What they're doing is they're appealing to a certain group of individuals, and they're kind of telling them what they want to hear, right? So what you do is you get different news agencies from across the world, so different countries, right? And then you want to have some coherence within them, and that is more likely a fact than some independent interpretation of like classified documents, right? So there's facts, like what is a fact? There's the blurb thingy, that was the UFO, Or there is like pictures of classified documents in Trump's estate. And then Trump admitting that he took them. But that's a different thing than a blurb and people that are giving testimonies about UFO abductions, all sharing similar, the psychological trait of suggestibility. And we also have other evidence, like when the movie, like there was some movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out, there was a huge spike in reports of alien abductions and stuff, correlated with the movie, right?
I agree with you on the video aspect of catching UFOs on camera,
Mhm.
but the FBI has released documents regarding UFO like ships in the 1940s. They've released for the public to see online actually. So,
Mhm.
I believe it's Project Bluebeam, if I'm not mistaken. You know? The Project
I know
Bluebeam?
about it vaguely, yeah.
I believe it was Project Bluebeam, where that guy released his documents. So I believe it's like a certain like year span before they publicly release it to us.
Yeah.
And there was like multiple reports of unidentified flying objects that weren't known to us at the time. That wasn't Russian. Like they thought it was Russians, and the Russians thought it was Americans, and the Americans thought it was the Chinese, and the Chinese thought it was like this weird conundrum. And then again, it just ended up posting it as declassified, is that what it's called?
Mhm.
We don't know what it is, so they're just
Unidentified.
identified, yeah, basically.
Mhm.
All the documents are there for, it's really cool.
Yeah. So document is equivalent to the testimony. It's not the object itself.
Mhm.
You know, like if you're going to release the documents, show us the ship too. Like have like a little dinosaur exhibit, have the spaceship.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Let's walk around there, touch stuff. Like go walk through walls a bit. Hey, this is super cool. I can walk through this wall.
Speaking of I don't know anything about the UFO thing that's going on. I very rarely watch the news, but when you mention something to do with the blur,
Yeah.
with whatever evidence is given by the public, I find it interesting that as advanced as our phones are and kind of how high quality the cameras are that are in them, no mobile phone or cell phone, as you call them, is able to ever capture the texture of the moon. And I find that interesting. So no matter how much you zoom into the moon, it will always be blurry. I don't know if you noticed that. So I wonder if I'm not condoning the blurry photographs, but I'm saying that there could be an issue itself with the cameras that we have accessible to us.
I think it's the distance that the atmosphere is in the way, and there's particles that are in between us and the moon, and that makes it more blurry. It could also be the resolution of the cameras
You
themselves.
see the textures and stuff of like the craters,
On your mobile phone
not
camera.
mine, but there are newer phones where you can. Where you
Okay.
can see like the craters and whatnot, but see like the texture itself and like that fine of a image. I don't believe so.
Well, by texture, I mean just any kind of detail, minute detail. It's just always a blur of light.
Could be a light thing.
Newer phones actually.
Oh, do you know?
Yeah.
My
It's like
phone's very old. So.
okay, the newer ones I believe I can this year.
So what we're really doing is we're talking about the knowledge problem again, right? Like how do we know what is true? And the justification factor, determining what is evidence, what is the quality of the evidence, what is credibility, how much time do we have to evaluate this evidence, is important. And so, yeah. So, okay. So we got to the point where we talked about the relationship between self-awareness and the influence of the self on our awareness, which is important. And we didn't talk about functions really.
Yeah, we'll just sidetrack.
We're getting to that. We're getting there. Because the next step is to say that there is a function of meditation or mindfulness that will have an effect on the self that influences consciousness, right? Which would be that there is less of a, we have to have some way to quantify this here. But yeah, that's what the effect would be for that one. And so different functions or decisions or actions, we want to find a way to plug them into this kind of system that I'm discussing here. How does it affect certain things? And so, yes, that's what we want to talk about now. Because what we'll do is we take the function and we solve the problems down here. So what function would we use for cognitive dissonance? Or the biases? And one thing that we talked about when James brought up meditation is this trio of meditation, education, feedback, right? When it comes to like self-awareness or biases or whatever. And so when we have these functions, as these problems arise in the self or within the group as an emergent phenomena, we will practice the functions that are directly related to the underlying properties of the mind and or self and or group. And then that way, we're coherently solving the problems in a nicely typed package. Right? And then we can test it too. It still satisfies falsification because we can say, well, does this representation of the function solve this problem? And if it doesn't, well, then we have to find a different one. But the underlying, like almost mathematics that I'm trying to extract from this, like identifying the specific properties and then having some form of functional relationship to solve problems that exist within these, or that manifest with the combination of these properties or something of the nature. That's really what we're looking for, because that way you can coherently justify it and it becomes more objective. You can say, if you have this problem, then you can do this. And that universal approach to phenomena and or issues is scientific. We want to have universal statements that apply to particular cases.
Universal statements that apply to particular cases.
Yeah.
An example.
So all people that suffer from cognitive dissonance can learn to regulate their emotions, be mindful of their self-esteem, engage in realistic, empowering thoughts to balance the self-esteem problem, and I guess practice acceptance of valid evidence. And that'll work. And so the hypothesis would be that will work for all cases of cognitive dissonance. And then we'd have to test it and say, well, what is the ratio for that little algorithm I gave, 1, 2, 3? What is the ratio? So let's say it's like 70%. So if you get a 70% correlation, 70% of the people that do this, hypothetically, we fix the cognitive dissonance issue. They're not engaging in narcissistic reframing of the context to avoid criticism, for example. Right? Then we're going to look at this last 30%. Well, it's obviously incorrect. This is like 70. Look at the last 30% and say, how can we modify the algorithm to include that? That way you've done it all. And then you go on to the next problem. Right? And so one thing is defining the problems. And this is going to be relatively empirical, you know, I would say. We got to kind of go out there and bump our head on the wall to know that we need to build a ladder or a set of stairs or an elevator. Right? Maybe there'll be some things we can foresee in the future, like it's a rational evaluation. I believe this is the case. I've kind of calculated it. And I project that there will be this issue and we will account for it in advance. That could be a thing too. But I would still say, let's test it. Let's not make an assumption. Let's go out there, test it out, see what it looks like, and then boom, we're good to go.
So is this some sort of a thing that would require a large collaboration? Like, for example, you see in social sciences, everyone's doing, like in psychology, everyone's doing their own research, and it's like not connected to a bigger picture. It's fragmented. Is something like this in your vision requires a big collaboration where everyone figures out a portion of it, but it's all interconnected, something like that.
Exactly. It's a unification of like psychology and or social science. That's what that's how I'm thinking about it. And yeah, so like there's every word on here basically has the huge books written about it, like 1,000-page Oxford handbooks, you know, like Self, I have like 1,000-page Oxford handbook on that one word. And I'm like, I'm going to read it. Now I'm 38. I'm like, I bought this like 10 years ago. Or 5 years ago. Like, what? When am I going to do that?
Fall to the rabbit holes.
Oh, if all those books fell on you in my living room, it'd be a rabbit hole. You have to take yourself out. You're like, oh my God, where's the light?
Sign me up.
Okay, so yeah, so the relationship between function and problems. I think that's kind of the next step for next week. And but this time we covered some good territory, had some good tangents to connect it in. And yeah, what do you guys think? Anything else you want to talk about?
I just want to tap in to say thanks for having me. It's my first week, and I'll be here next week. It's very interesting.
Awesome. Do you have the What's Up chat group link?
No, I don't. I'm waiting on a new phone in the mail. So I dropped on the kitchen tile with a shockproof case, and it's still somehow smashed. So hey, I'll get that set up with Dimitri so as soon as I get that in the mail. But I appreciate it for it's nice.
Cool. Yeah. The What's Up group thing is there for you.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, man.
We'll see you guys next week.
Thank you, guys. That's nice.
Have a good night, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.